All right, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off here. Welcome everyone to our second panel of our annual policy summit. Just a reminder, this Zoom is being recorded and folks will get an opportunity to watch it at a later date as well. My name is Benjamin Orr. I'm the founder, president, and CEO of the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. For those of you who are not familiar with MDCEP, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that believes that every Marylander should be able to achieve their full potential in a healthy economy that offers a widely shared and rising standard of living. And certainly housing is at the center of that vision. Affordable housing is at the center of that vision. As I said, this is our second panel. We had a great conversation this morning about workforce issues. And this afternoon, we're going to hear from our panelists and from your questions as we speak to what we gain when we center racial equity in housing policy and what this could look like and means for the future of housing. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, the Annie Casey Foundation, the Maryland's State Education Association, the NAACP, Strong Future Maryland, and the University of Baltimore College of Public Affairs. Raquel is going to drop a link in the chat for our audience members to give us a little bit more information about yourself and check in. And without further ado, I'm going to jump right into things and introduce our moderator for today. Excuse me. Melissa Bondi is the State and Local Policy Director at Enterprise Community Partners. And at Enterprise, she advocates and tracks housing policies that work to improve life outcomes for low-income residents through housing preservation and production, through bridging the racial equity gap, and increasing resources for community development. On a personal note, I've known Melissa as a tireless advocate for improving outcomes for folks struggling to make ends meet for more than a decade. And I'm excited for her to lead this conversation and introduce our panelists. Melissa?
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Ben. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. I am Melissa. I use she, her pronouns, and really congratulations to the center and everyone on your 4th annual policy summit. I'm going to start by introducing our wonderful panelists for today's conversation. I'm going to introduce all of you in turn. And after I do, I would like each of you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work to help lead into our conversation. So I'll start with Peggy Bailey, who serves as the Senior Advisor on Rental Assistance at the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. Peggy, welcome.
Thank you, Melissa, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm sitting to you, and I'm coming to you from the HUD building. We've been, some of us have been here in person for a couple of weeks now. It's been great to see everybody. As Melissa said, I am the Senior Advisor on Rental Assistance, which means that I help advise the Secretary on everything related to rental assistance. So that includes the Section 8 program, the public housing program, and our HUD multifamily programs, and how we can both increase access to housing for renters and create more rental housing. Embedded in that are also the services and supports that you'll hear several of us talk about that can help families not only stay housed, but also thrive and build savings and build assets and move into the space of the home ownership side of HUD. Before coming to HUD, this is my first time in federal service. I was at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which is a strong partner with the Maryland Center, and served as the Vice President for Housing Policy, and also worked on housing and services prior to that at the center, connecting, really focused on people experiencing homelessness and how to connect people with both the housing and the services supports that they need. That is where Tanika and I first got to know each other, and it's been, and I'm just really glad to be here today. So thanks, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Next, I'd like to introduce Mark Counsel, who is a client advocate at Healthcare for the Homeless. Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. My name is Mark, and I go by he, him, Mark Counsel. And I got involved in advocacy due to the fact that I was homeless several times several years ago, and ended up in a shelter. And I felt as though that I need to not really help myself. I was looking for helping of other people. When I seen people out living on the streets and everything else, and I was like, you know, this is not right. So I've been doing several work around the homeless population and the sickness that they care that's out there, that the abusement that happened to them. I have did several protests. I have did several sleep out, do outreach, where the people are out in the streets or out in numerous hotels as far as the city concerned, where to tell me about far as what's going on there, how they live in, stuff like that, and things that could be better. And I've been working side by side on trying to get everyone housing.
Mark, thank you so much. And our third panelist is Tanika Richardson. She is a policy analyst at the Maryland Center on Policy. Tanika, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. I am a policy analyst here at MedSep. I came to MedSep, as Peggy mentioned. I started out here as a fellow from the center. It was a 2-year fellowship, and I recently transitioned to a full-time policy analyst this summer. Forgot my pronouns are she, hers. My background before coming to the center, I worked as a housing counselor for Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership. I did that for about 3 years. I was also on the board for 2 years prior to that. And then how I came into being on the board is that I was also a recipient of the housing mobility program. So I've done a lot of work for at least kind of almost going on like 10 years around housing mobility work. And I currently on the expert panel for the HUD mobility demonstration as well.
Fantastic. So we have really an outstanding and well-rounded panel to help answer and talk through some important conversations today about housing and justice. So to put a little bit of this in perspective, many folks in the audience may already be aware of this, but for many decades in the United States, racist policies and practices have dictated how Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color or BIPOC communities in the US could live their lives, the kinds of homes and neighborhoods they could live in, the wages and the wealth they could earn and build, their access to services and basic daily needs, and their chances for upward mobility in life. Racism and segregation in housing and across so many other longstanding systems have led to the racial wealth gap and the racial outcomes gap that we experience in every community in the United States today. 7 out of 10 Americans experiencing homelessness in the United States are Black, Indigenous, or persons of color. 80% of people in the United States who are at risk of eviction are persons of color. This was a pre-pandemic number that has only exacerbated over the course of COVID-19. Our housing market and access to wealth creation through ownership are the foundation of the rise of the middle class in our country. Yet our legacy is one that continues to perpetuate inequitable access to these fundamental benefits for persons of color across the US. That's equally true in Maryland. Our work at Enterprise attempts to address these inequities in a number of ways. We have a National Equitable Path Forward initiative, which is intended to help dismantle the legacy of racism in housing, both on the beneficiary side, the households who may have access to and choices in their housing that is affordable and enables them, to achieve greater opportunity and quality of life, and also in terms of providers, who is actually helping to build in communities, to preserve in communities, and to produce economic benefits in who's hired and who's actually constructing, preserving, and managing housing. We also do fundamental policy work at the federal level, alongside with HUD, also at the state level, regional level, and at the local level in Maryland and across the country. We've worked on things like affirmatively furthering fair housing, justice-involved housing solutions, source of income discrimination protection efforts, as well as advocacy on the front lines for all of the areas, both pre and during the pandemic, that are threatening housing stability and affordability. We also do programmatic work, and especially in areas helping to serve Native Americans, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and working in rural areas as well as urban and suburban, all with an eye toward achieving outcomes, not just using a racial equity lens, but actually holding ourselves accountable on outcomes in the area of eliminating racial equity gaps. With that in mind, Enterprise was really privileged to be part of the team that was hired by the state of Maryland to help complete the most recent statewide housing needs assessment, which was published not that long ago. I'll put a link in the chat if that's helpful. That housing needs assessment looks at the current state and conditions of the housing market across all vectors in the state of Maryland. It looks locally, regionally, and also statewide at current conditions, current needs, current supply of housing for both ownership and rental, and then also identifies areas through data and through stakeholder interviews, engagement, and other research on what are the needs projected moving forward and what are the fundamental or most high priority needs today that are being unmet for the next 10 years. Within the work of the housing needs assessment and the publications, I won't go into this too much in depth. We have other experts on the call or the video who may be helping and talking through some of this. But what we learned is that nearly half of all renters in Maryland are cost burdened. That's 335,000 renters out of a total of just over 715,000. Cost burden, of course, means that someone is paying more than 30% of the income available to them in order to have a roof over their head. And more than 30% is deemed by HUD and as a national standard to be less sustainable. You have less money available to help meet other needs, to save money, or to handle emergencies. In addition to the housing kind of cost burden issue, there's also the fundamental question of those who are paying up to 50% or more, those who are severely cost burdened. And disproportionately in Maryland and across the nation, those who are severely cost burdened tend to be extremely low income households, seniors, which are increasing at a higher rate compared to 2000 than almost any other population. Households of color, BIPOC households in Maryland are disproportionately impacted by being severely cost burdened. And those who live both in the most populous urban areas of the state and also in rural areas. So this is an issue that is facing lots of different parts of Maryland, lots of different parts of the country. The housing needs assessment is important because it not only shows us where we are, what programs are working, what gaps and needs remain, but also gives us a roadmap on what kinds of interventions at the state level, with our federal partners, at the local level, and then also with private sector working in partnership with public sector officials, we can help to find solutions and meet the needs of current and future Marylanders. So, with that kind of as a backdrop into our conversation, I'm going to turn things over and start asking questions of our panelists and engage you on some of your expertise. Then we'll be taking questions from the audience later and having a chance to open up this dialogue. Let me start, if I can, with Mark. There are serious consequences for people who end up without homes, living either in unstable temporary conditions or on the streets. And we know that the pandemic has only made things worse for both public health, individual health, and the challenges in finding and securing housing. You are a client advocate. Your commitment to ending homelessness is driven by your own personal experience.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the day-to-day challenges of your community that's preventing them from finding stable housing?
Well, it's really a number of things. Like you were stated, racial plays a part into it. Um, Sadly, may sound like of housing ability is a part in as well. Meaning that we know that the city has housing. Why they not rebuilding or recondition these houses is beyond our, it's a slow process. They moving, I'm not going to take that away from, they are moving to house a lot, but it's a slow process, meaning that people are still dying out here. And the fact that, like you said, the COVID is out here, and that was something that we didn't need it at this present time. Yeah, and being the fact that a lot of people, they had put people from the shelters and put them into hotels, and trying to move them back into conjugal living. Now, the main thing they was talking about far as this COVID is to stay, the distance of 6 feet. And you can't do that when you're in a shelter with 300-400 some more people. So it's like they trying to put these people back into conjugal living, and this is one of the things that we've been basically been trying to fight against. Do not move these people back into conjugal living. And this COVID is out here, is for real. It has killed several other people. And it's not going to stop until all of us, it doesn't matter whether you homeless or not, it's just finally going to destroy us all. So you do have to take precautions on it. It's a lot of other things. It's a lack of funds. It's capability. As far as with a lot of people that's out homeless, most of them have mental challenge to deal with and everything like that. And it's hard to say, okay, well, I'm gonna put Mary Jane and Sue inside a house and leave her there. Now, if Mary Jane and Sue is not really capable of running a house, because a lot of them don't, they get to a point where they in the house and they like, in the next month, I have seen it where they have lose their house because they don't want to be there because it's lonely in there. So they ended up back into the shelter. The shelter I was staying at is on Falls Way, Baltimore, Maryland, and Weinberg. And I have seen that door being swinging back and forth. But like, gee, weren't you just how? And they came back because, mismanagement, is a lot. It's really a lot of things that will stop people from getting housing. And I can't say which one is the main one, because it's like all of them tied in together. And
Sure.
it's, it's the money, housing, the loneliness, the sickness, all of it just in it together.
Thank you so much, Mark. My next question is for Peggy, and kind of picking up on that. At the federal level, we have seen as much intervention and attempts for intervention as a result of the pandemic in housing we've seen for some time. The House has passed its version of the Build Back Better Act, which of course includes a number of groundbreaking provisions for housing aid. And we're starting to learn a little bit more even this week about kind of where the Senate is thinking about some of these things as well. There's no question that the proposed Build Back Better agenda includes substantial federal investments in public housing, rental assistance, down payment. Really, it runs the gamut. It's a generational level of commitment that's being proposed. Would you tell us a little bit more about the housing provisions in Build Back Better and kind of how they'll help to address those who are struggling to secure housing, including but not limited to those that Mark is talking about? Just in what ways will Build Back Better be helpful?
Sure, thanks, Melissa. And yes, if the president's Build Back Better agenda includes a historic amount of resources and funding for not only HUD, but the other federal agencies that also deliver housing services and supports, including the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the VA. And so we're super excited about this potential opportunity. And I think too, while there's some of the president's main priorities are represented in the housing investment within the Build Back Better plan. If you think about climate and investing in climate, there are billions of dollars suggested to dedicated to reinvigorating multifamily housing and public housing, especially. There's the opportunity to also create new housing opportunities for people, and in both of those instances, we know that modern building codes and building standards will automatically help improve the environmental footprint of affordable housing in this country. And also we have a commitment to making sure we're locating that housing in places that are resilient. From a racial equity standpoint, I mentioned the public housing investment. This is huge. About 70% of people living in HUD-assisted housing and in public housing specifically are people of color. So much of that housing is 50, 60, 70 years old and in desperate need of repair. Too many children are growing up with mold or in their homes that leads to asthma. They're living in housing that has lead paint. And this is going to be an opportunity to transform public housing back into something that people can be proud to live in. We also have a significant investment in Native American housing and for people living on tribal lands, and for Native Hawaiians as well, to be able to improve housing quality and address the housing needs of people living in Indian country. In addition to all of that, one thing I want to make sure that all of you understand is in the Build Back Better plan is a program called the Community Reinvestment Fund, which could be transformative to communities because it invests in community-based organizations. These are resources that states are not eligible to apply for, cities are not eligible to apply for. Only community-based organizations with strong experience in the community and that represent the community in which they are working in could receive these resources. This is something that, especially if there are any funders that are listening, should be looking at now. Because if you know of community organizations that are strong but always struggle with some of the federal requirements and things that we require when you're applying for funds, I can't promise that we'll reduce many of those barriers. But what we can do is plan ahead and try to help some of those organizations now by investing in what I call the unsexy things, the computers, extra staffing, things like that, that could help that organization apply for those funds once they're available and make a huge difference in communities across the country, but particularly in Maryland. It is so important that we invest in community-based organizations because they're the ones that know what communities need. So those are just some highlights of what's in the Build Back Better plan.
Hey, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, and for highlighting that particular fund in particular. The next question is for Tanika. So what are some of the ways you think Maryland could best take advantage of additional funding from Build Back Better? From some of the things that Peggy has said or other things that you're seeing in your work. Would you share with us a little bit about how investing in direct assistance could bring our country and Maryland too one step closer to safe and stable housing for everyone?
Sure. Thanks, Melissa, for the question. So even before the pandemic, Maryland, we had an affordable housing crisis here in the state. Too many Marylander households are severely cost burdened, spending more than half of their income on housing, on their housing costs. Severely cost-burdened households are more likely than other renters to sacrifice other necessities like healthy food and healthcare to pay their rent, and also more likely to experience unstable situations like evictions. Currently, 13% of renters in Maryland are behind in their rental payments, and 74% of extremely low-income renter households in the state are severely cost-burdened. As you and Peggy mentioned earlier, the Build Back Better Act does include the $25 billion to expand rental assistance to hundreds of thousands of households with the housing choice vouchers, which is important because currently only 1 in 4 households nationwide are eligible to receive them. So it's absolutely vital that this is happening at this time. Peggy already mentioned this as well, but just want to re-highlight that in addition to the expansion of the vouchers, there is $65 billion to preserve public housing for 2.5 million residents, and another $15 billion to build and preserve more than 150,000 homes for people with the greatest needs through the National Housing Trust Fund. These investments will advance racial equity, as recent reports estimate that more than 70% of those served through the expansion would be people of color who are currently left out of this vital assistance. Here in Maryland, it's estimated that approximately 5,000 households will benefit from the voucher expansion, many of which are headed by women with children under the age of 18. Maryland is also estimated to receive approximately $225 million out of the $15 billion slated for the Housing Trust Fund. This funding will also go a long way to address the affordable housing crisis, as Maryland currently has a shortage of 85,000 rental homes for its lowest income households. The direct assistance to families is an important step to reduce homelessness, overcrowding, housing instability, and racial disparities in housing opportunities across the state. Research shows that vouchers sharply reduce homelessness, housing instability, and which has been linked to serious adverse effects of families' health and children's development. Vouchers can also give families greater choice about where they live, kind of going back to the mobility housing voucher piece. Research is showing that when vouchers enables families to move to lower poverty neighborhoods, research has found that children and those families earn more as adults and are substantially more likely to attend college. In addition, by reducing rental costs, vouchers leave low-income people with more resources for other basic necessities such as food and medicine. Furthermore, homelessness and other problems that vouchers address greatly affect people of color due to the long history of racial discrimination. So vouchers can also play a significant role in reducing this disparity as well.
Tanika, thank you for that. I'm going to ask my next question for Peggy, but if other folks on the panel want to respond, we'll have a little bit of time left for that before I turn to even more drawing out questions for you. We all know that Congress has a huge role to play in funding and policy decisions that get a lot of public attention. But the work at the agency level, the work at HUD's level has a gigantic impact on how policies are implemented, how funding is distributed, and how families are actually benefited. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit more about how HUD is approaching racial equity and other forms of equity and ways that the agency can help lead state and local governments in the right direction on prioritizing equity?
Sure. So the first way that we can be helpful at HUD is being an example of acknowledging the role that we have played in perpetuating racism and discrimination for people of color and for other marginalized communities. That making ourselves vulnerable will make it okay for state and local governments to also make themselves vulnerable and be explicit about the ways that we have done that, because that is the first step, and the only way to be able to reverse it is to first acknowledge the problem that we have caused. So that's the first step. The second piece is that, and it's really, we're living that out due to President Biden's executive order around racial equity and other executive orders that address the needs of other marginalized populations. That first and foremost, we've been taking these last 11 months to do an internal analysis ourselves of thinking about the ways that we have perpetuated racism and discrimination, what we can do to address that, and looking inward. Next year, you'll start to see more of that being released publicly of the external ways that we want to improve our policies and practices to eliminate racism and discrimination in the things that we do. I think also we're not only naming the things, but trying to figure out how to actually make change. One of the initiatives that I'm heading up across the agency is thinking about how do we create a continuum for renters, from renters to home ownership, and trying to reduce the barriers to home ownership for renters, while doing that in ways that are not paternalistic, but instead are listening to families about the needs that they have and helping them access resources that people with higher incomes and more family generational wealth access. And a lot of that is around helping families save money, because our rental assistance programs are designed in ways that can prohibit savings, and also build credit history and the role that landlords and owners can play in that for families that are paying their rent and their bills on time. Can we help them create a credit history for themselves? And then looking at down payment assistance for families, so that they can have that down payment assistance to get into the home ownership space, which sometimes can be cheaper than the rent that they've been paying. And the last piece is then also trying to look at ways to increase the number of single family homes that are able to be purchased, and having them stay as opportunities for home ownership, and not automatically move into the rental market. So those are some things that we have on our plate, and the ways that we're thinking about improving equity. I should just say, in addition to racial equity, we have also taken many steps, whether it's related to affirmatively furthering fair housing, maintaining access to shelter for the LGBTQ community, and restoring that from what happened in the previous administration, and looking at ways to help people with disabilities access housing, are all things that are also ways to eliminate disparities among those other populations that have been marginalized.
Thank you so much for that. I want to just take a brief moment and acknowledge a couple of things. One, for those who do have questions for the panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A option or chat to write your questions in. We acknowledge that Peggy has been so gracious with her time, and she'll be able to stay with us till about 2 o'clock, but we'll have to move to another meeting with the secretary. So if you have specific questions on HUD, or questions specifically directed at Peggy, would you be kind enough to put those in the chat so she has a chance to look and respond to them before she has to leave? I just wanted to make mention of that. With that, I'm actually going to turn over to another question for Tanika. You've been taking a close look at the way the state of Maryland's investments in housing interact with racial and ethnic equity. Would you be willing to share with us some of the ways that past housing policy decisions have affected BIPOC, Black and Brown residents and communities, and then any ideas or suggestions on the ways Maryland could improve its housing policies to advance racial equity and economic justice?
Sure. Again, thanks, Melissa, for the question, and thanks for Peggy. If I don't get to talk to you before you leave. So as most of us on this call probably know, that Maryland has a deep rooted history of public and private housing discrimination, running from the nation's first official residential segregation plan back in 1911 through racially biased mortgage lending in early years of this century to the recent source of income rental discrimination. Like in many early U.S. cities, growth of heavy manufacturing in Baltimore City, which attracted new African-American residents from more southern states, and immigrations from abroad, prompted fears of encroachment into surrounding areas that were largely occupied by wealthy white residents. The public sector attempted to implement racial zoning and other actions to promote segregation, and the private sector used deed restrictions toward the same end. Federal regulations that denied financial capital to many protected classes bolstered these local actions. Together, these discriminatory efforts resulted in neighborhoods that became highly segregated by race, ethnicity, and income across the state, but especially in the Baltimore area. African American residents remain the most segregated by any racial group. While that segregation has decreased slightly as the region has grown economically, African American residents are still by far the most likely to live in neighborhoods with concentrated poverty and face the largest disparities in education and health outcomes. African American individuals and families face housing needs at higher rates that would be expected even after accounting for income. African American residents are also more likely to be homeless and at risk for homelessness, experiencing high cost burdens, living in high public subsidized housing, and being denied mortgage loans. And I should say, as a consequence of all of those things, are more likely to rent as well versus holding a home. While recent research has focused on the ability of housing vouchers to enable low-income residents to access high opportunity areas, only 25% of vouchers holders live in high opportunity areas in the state. Even with the recent expansion of voucher funding, finding a landlord to accept a housing voucher remains a challenge, with four out of 5 voucher holders in the state describing their experience using a voucher as difficult or very difficult. So to answer Peggy's question, what are some of the factors that have contributed to this over the years? We have a continuing widened wealth gap, community opposition to affordable housing, limited public subsidies for low-income housing, limited resources to create needed rental housing, land use and zoning laws that limited the amount and location of multifamily housing and development, lender discrimination, low home values in neighborhoods suffering disinvestment that themselves constitute a barrier to new investment, limited public resources to invest in neighborhoods needing significant redevelopment, high land costs, particularly in opportunity areas due to limits on development, opportunity, and other factors. So some of the main solution and talker points I've kind of come up with through my research has kind of been like a resounding theme. So I just want you to know this list is not exhaustive, but some of the common themes that came from the research thus far are ways that Maryland could improve the housing situation through the state is: 1, to continue to collaborate regionally to address barriers and expand capacity to further housing choice for all protected classes. Continuing to increase rental housing options through regional mobility efforts to enable choice among voucher holders and expand affordable, accessible rental housing. Advocate for criteria in the low-income housing tax credit program that increases affordable and accessible rental stock in areas of opportunity, and also helps grow development in those areas as well. 4, advocating for programs and policies to address homeownership disparities among protected classes. 5, preserving existing homes and mitigating displacement of low-income households. 6, establishing a strong central fair housing agency. And I just want to point out that this is kind of more important because I know last year in Maryland we passed the source of income discrimination, but just through some of my research from other states that passed it, a lot of states are still seeing housing voucher discrimination take place because no one is monitoring that law. So it's good to have on the books, but if no one is enforcing it, then it's kind of null and void. So like I said earlier, this list is not exhaustive, but these are just some of the things that came out. And then before I end, I wanted to point out to Peggy before she hopped off, I know she was talking about some of the things that HUD could do. So I just wanted to take this opportunity with like one, I know, at least for me personally, just in my experience with housing vouchers, and I see some comments in the chat about zoning, and I do agree that single family zoning is an issue as well. But one of the things I would like to see HUD do is, I don't know, I might be dreaming, but it would be nice for one, if vouchers could be an entitlement program. I'm one that believes that vouchers are, well, not necessarily vouchers, but that housing is a human right? So everyone should have access to housing. That is the most fundamental, crucial before you can even get into anything else. Policy-wise, it all boils down to that person having a home, right? Because how can they focus on anything else when they don't have a safe or stable place to lay their head? So that's the first thing. The second thing is states and localities are already picking up the torch and passing source of income discrimination laws. So it would be nice to see this pass on the federal level as well. HUD making, that a law as well. And not only that, I would probably add a star to that. With the, a lot of landlords are still using loopholes, even though we have the National Source of Income Discrimination Law. So one common loophole that hasn't been addressed is landlords requiring voucher holders to have 3 times the contract rent in order to be able to afford the unit or to apply to the unit. So that is ridiculous to me. I don't know why that is. I do know some states are looking into that and have kind of passed laws kind of prohibiting that as well, but it would be nice again if that could get some attention on a state and federal level as well. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Thanks, Tanika. Yeah, no, and I'll just say that those are things that are on our radar as well. I think, we see the investment that you mentioned about vouchers and the Build Back Better proposal we see that as a down payment on getting toward the day when we have universal eligibility for the universally available vouchers for folks. That is a piece of the president's agenda since he was running for office, and it's something that we're still continuing to figure out how we can keep marching toward that day. And then on the anti-discrimination measures, I think some of those things are already things that we can fight against given the fair housing implications, and are things that folks should definitely bring to the attention of the field office at HUD and the fair housing experts there now. The other things that we're doing in the short term are advancing ways to incentivize landlords to accept vouchers and making sure that they understand that we're there to support them in this effort. We understand that they're and what we've also been able to see is a lot of those landlord incentives, especially like landlord incentive pools that have dollars available for landlords to access resources if damage happens to their unit or things like that. Actually, landlords don't end up tapping into that because surprise, surprise, voucher families are just like every other family. And there is research to show that they're actually better tenants than the general population when it comes to maintaining and protecting their units. So it's actually, while we have to unfortunately lean into and accept some of the racist and discriminatory and biases that landlords have, we're also able to show that they're unfounded as well.
I'll make one quick comment, and then I got my next question will be from Mark, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. So please do, thank you for questions that have already been placed in chat. Please continue to send them in. Senator Tim Kaine in neighboring Virginia has actually previously sponsored legislation on kind of nationalizing source of income discrimination protections. And so depending on the climate and circumstances of being able to kind of reintroduce that legislation, we know that that is something that at a minimum, his office, which is in our region, is very committed to and had a fair amount of co-sponsors. And I know that Enterprise worked to try to help see if we could get that expanded as well. So on top of all of Peggy's great responses, there's also what we can do with other branches of government to help them bring the full weight to bear on housing as a human right and protection. And as you mentioned, Tanika, enforcement is critical, or the protections really don't have as much weight as they deserve. Mark, my next question will be for you, and then we're going to open it up for audience Q&A. We've talked a lot about racial identity in this conversation, and rightly so, but it is really just one of the intersecting barriers that people who experience homelessness can face. And I wondered if you would share with us a bit more about your experience as an advocate, any pushback in your role due to stereotypes and kind of old world thinking and stigma about homelessness, about poverty, and how can allies who are committed to supporting your work in ending homelessness, how can we be better supporting people who are directly affected by policy decisions when we are doing our advocacy for homelessness prevention?
Well, thank you. Well, to start, the communication is a big step ahead. To be involved in the work I do. I mean, I'm in several organizations fighting for the homeless population. I'm in a group called Housing Our Neighbors, HUN for short. And I've been in there for probably like 7, 8 years. I became the leader organizer of that group. I'm in the LAC, Live Experience Advisory Committee. We work closely with the homeless service of the city, MOHS. I'm also on the board of director of ACH, Healthcare for the Homeless, and the CRC. So I've been doing a lot of work around helping the homeless population to find better homes. It's in the work that I have done, you know, we have their protests, we have marches, like I said, we did sleep out. And I've been involved in this for the longest time. I mean, like I said, I got involved in it, you know, to help others. Not really looking at myself. I mean, and then it's got to a point where these people really need help. These people have been let down by the city so many times, it's not even funny how the city had said they was going to do this and don't do this. And while they sitting down there playing, you know, people are dying, is dying with their without the accountability or whatever. We have seen a lot of city officials had said a lot of things, and all we basically saw was the fact that they was taking the money instead. But it's something has to change, and I'm thinking that we, the people, and I can change the system to make it better for us all. Like she was saying, that affordable housing is something that we really need, and it's something that should be on the top list. It's not really necessary. I mean, it's affordable housing and for low income as well. You know, I mean, it's like we get this raise, this 15 minimum wage or whatever, but the economy still goes up. So it's not like, and I never looked at the fact that it's supposed to be the raise. It's because the economy going to go up 10% just as well as the raise going up. We never could catch up with the economy of this, you know. But yeah, we need a lot of support in all the work that I have done and will continue to do to help the homeless population to get home. And also, I'm willing to work with the city to have a plan in place. I found out the fact that Baltimore City is way behind in the housing, in the homeless community. You know, it's like they push this aside. We had a lot of promise from a lot of city officials, mayors, and everybody else, and it's getting to a point where the city is not, I mean, the people is not being, they don't want to be heard anymore, because it's just the fact that they keep on lying to these people about far as this and that and everything else, and it's they just tired of waiting.
People need promises kept, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark, so much for that.
Sure.
So I'll make a final call for questions that folks from the audience may have to please go ahead and leave them in chat. I'm going to now start introducing some of the questions that have been submitted so far into chat. This can be for any one of our panelists to answer. I'll help answer too. But as a practical matter, let me just go ahead. I'm not sure if I'm going to have them directly in order, but let me start with a question from Greg saying, many states monitor their housing shortage numbers. Does Maryland? And if so, does our state set goals for new housing? Would anybody like to take that on? If not, I would be glad to, but I want to defer to the experts on the panel.
It should be something, they should set goals. I don't really know. I do know that Maryland is the richest state out there, and we have the richest country out here. It's like, what happened to Baltimore? I mean, it's like, okay, what happened to Baltimore? Basically, we elect a mayor. You know, this mayor that we have is not really doing what he's supposed to be doing. It's like, and these landlords that's getting away. We did December the 7th, we was down at City Hall trying to fight a landlord because this landlord was not doing what this landlord was supposed to be doing, taking care of the housing. You know, people was paying, but there was no hot water. There was mold in this building. And it was like the community came out far as, you know, to say, hey, you know, what's going on? My money is here, you know, why can't we help? And that was December the 7th. And it was like, they still pushing people out into the street. The homeless population do not need any more people. We do not need any more. I can't stress that enough. We really don't. You know, we out here literally dying. We are dying. We are being abused. You know, we become down to nothing. And half of us, you know, if not all of us, have built Baltimore City. And this is how they treated us.
Mark, you make a great point in answer to that question about the notion that there's the role that the state should play, but there's also the role that localities play, right? The state is going to see and should see a big picture. And Greg, to your question, I'll just say that the housing needs assessment, which is done right now once every 10 years, is really intended to help establish at a point in time in 1 year, where are we? What are the needs? What's emerging either as a new trend or, you know, the exacerbation of an existing one, like Mark talked about earlier, which is, man, wages are not keeping pace with a cost of living, not keeping pace with the cost of housing. And, you know, that math is getting worse and worse and worse. So that document, the housing needs assessment at the state level, really helps us as a blueprint. There are also several national organizations that do their own analysis, and the Maryland Center is very well aware and works with them, and I won't steal their thunder. But in terms of understanding kind of where is Maryland at a point in time? But there's also the work at the local level. There's what's happening in and around Baltimore. There's what's happening in and around the DC suburbs of Montgomery and Prince George's County. There's what's happening in Annapolis and Anne Arundel and on and on and on. All of the localities in Maryland also are much closer to the ground, much more aware of and hearing from neighbors, persons experiencing homeless or at risk of it, persons in fear of eviction, about what the needs on the ground are. And so there is a role to play, I think, for state government and for local government, both to understand their depth of need and then to set targets, to actually explicitly provide an accountability, a transparency, and a commitment on what is being proposed to address those numbers, those human beings, so that all of us can work together, because it shouldn't always be on the back just of government. There's private sector role to play, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's other private sector providers, whether it's wraparound service nonprofit organizations and people who've been doing exceptional work during the pandemic to help mitigate the worst outcomes for vulnerable residents in Maryland and across the country, to say, okay, here's the problem. We can quantify it, we can look at it. There are real life examples of human beings telling us what they need. What now we can start to build a plan toward addressing it. That'd be my response on that one. Any other comments from folks on this one before we go to our next question?
I think you summed it up pretty good. I was going to mention the housing report. You already mentioned that. And there are a number of, like you mentioned, national nonprofits that do check in on Maryland and track with those numbers, and we get a lot of our research from there as well, so no rain on our thunder over here. So
we all learn and benefit from each other, right? We all learn and benefit from each other. I appreciate that. And for panelists, I can't always see all of you at once, so just pop right off mute if you'd like to weigh in. Your voices are the most important for our conversation and the questions coming from chat. Speaking of our next question, we all know that the programs and subsidies and work by nonprofits, the nonprofit sector, is not enough to solve our housing crisis. We have to eliminate structures such as racist single-family zoning. Who do you know who is working on that legislation? Again, I'll open up to panelists first, and then I'm happy to follow up as well. I've got some answers on that one too. Anybody want to take that one? Would you like me to go ahead?
I mean, I can go first, and
Please.
I will say that honestly, directly, I don't know if any, not saying that there's not any, but I don't know if any off the top of my head that's primarily focused on getting rid of single family zoning, whether it's on a local level or state level. I do know, I feel like the past 2 years I've been consumed with COVID protections, and that's kind of what's on my forefront, and kind of being some of the local and state coalition meetings going this year is again pushing COVID protections that maybe didn't get passed this past session, such as like funding the right to counsel and eviction diversion programs and things of that nature. That's still kind of what's been in the forefront. But I do absolutely agree that single family zoning is an issue, and it definitely is a torch that needs to be picked up.
Thanks. I'll follow up on that, and I'll mention two things. Last year in 2020, you may know that in the Maryland General Assembly, Vaughn Stewart had introduced kind of a housing package of legislation, and it included looking not entirely across the state, but looking in specific parts of the state as kind of like a pilot to look at examining and eliminating some of the kind of the worst case scenarios in single family zoning. Ultimately, that entire package was not adopted, but that doesn't mean that it could not be reintroduced into the General Assembly session in 2022. But I would recommend reaching out to Vaughn Stewart's office and see, what the future is for that particular item. There are so many housing related priorities that we have every General Assembly session, but he is someone who had actually taken a good swing at it at the state level. Everybody knows that many zoning regulations are adjudicated at the local level. Those are the full faith of local jurisdictions, municipalities, and counties, and that towns and communities help to make a lot of those choices. In Montgomery County, right now, there are substantial conversations happening on this very issue. And part of it is incorporated into kind of an overall comprehensive planning effort called Thrive 2050, which is really looking at where and how will Montgomery County grow and what will its needs be across housing, but a number of other factors as well, which has led to a lot of conversations about what is the role of single family zoning in the future for Montgomery County. And it's been a really contentious issue with a lot of very strong opinions on a lot of different sides, and candidly, a lot of folks who have different understandings of what it means when you say eliminate single family zoning. What do people perceive? What do they fear? What do they think is being eliminated versus what is actually being proposed for reconsideration? So it's an important set of conversations to have, but probably a really good idea to do our due diligence in advance and think through that. So I want to give last call for folks who may have questions, especially before we lose Peggy. I know her schedule is crunched. So any other questions? And if not, Peggy, if you're able, I'd love for you to just give us any final thoughts or advice, any final items from you before you have to go.
Sure. So I apologize for, I don't know what happened to my system. But yes, one, on the last question, I want to make sure that it's mentioned that within the Build Back Better plan that the president's put forward, there is zoning pieces in that. And particularly what we're focused on is rewarding communities that are working toward doing better and making sure they have the resources to continue their efforts. And so that is included as a piece of Build Back Better, and hopefully providing resources to help have the time for the community meetings and the education of local residents to help them understand what it is and what is happening and the evidence behind it. But just as a final thought, I just want to thank the Maryland Center for Economic Policy for having this forum. It's so important to have these conversations. I think focusing on being able to be explicit about the need to address equity, whether it's racial equity or equity and discrimination for other marginalized populations. As I started out my comments with, naming that it's an issue, and that we as the federal, state, and local governments have contributed to that issue is an important first step, and helping give the governments the grace to be able to admit that, so that we're not fighting because of past, but we're working on how to get how to do better in the future. And that's what either hopefully we're all here to do, but definitely you all are here to make sure that we do. And I just want to say we really appreciate all the work that's happening on the ground to move us to that better day when everybody has access to stable housing and the services and supports that they need.
Peggy, thank you so much. And thank you for HUD's partnership, leadership, and taking those important first steps to bring everybody else kind of into the same page for solutions together. We know you have to run. Really, truly appreciate your time. Thank you for participating with us today. So I'd like to ask, if I can, if Mark and Tanika, would you be willing to share with us maybe one or two really critical priorities? Could be a policy, could be a program, could be funding that you think are most critical for addressing Maryland's housing needs. We've talked about a lot of stuff today, but if you had a wish list for the holidays, what might be on your top list for most critical needs? And either of you can go first if you wish.
Housing for all. I mean, honestly, that's where I'm at. I mean, it's I don't know. It's like it's stressful. The people are tired. We actually do, and sad as may sound, people rather be outdoors, sleeping outside than in a shelter, which is like they sleep 2-3 blocks away from the shelter of Weinberg. And it was like, what is going on with these people and why are they sleeping? You know, it's the service, it's the people, it's the atmosphere. They'd rather be out in the cold than to be inside of a shelter as far as the service concerned. And it's like we do the homeless pig count, as far as counting the people that's outside, this, that, and all that, and get a active number about far as we'll put them in the shelter, and then the next day they would go right back out to where they were sleeping at. We do it for like 2 days in January coming up, and then the next day they would go right back out there. And it's like, why are you, it's like that's how they survive. Some people in the community will adopt certain people. If they see you homeless or whatever case may be, that neighborhood will adopt you and they will make sure you have 3 meals or whatever case may be. And the people that's the homeless, they okay with that. They like that. And they feel as though they a lot safer to that than being in a shelter where you get abused, you get things taken away from you, you get mistreated. And I had in the shelter that I had seen it all, where rape came involved in places, where death came in. It's like, I'm not safe in there. I'll probably be safe out on the street. And that's sad as may sound, that's where they are.
Thank you. Very powerful and understandable critical priorities. Tanika, how about from your perspective? What do you think are some of the most critical policies, programs, funding to address housing needs in Maryland?
Yeah, I think things that we could do here on the Maryland level is expand affordable housing. And I know there's a lot of discussion and debate about exactly what does affordable housing mean, at what level, what income level. I don't want to get into that debate, but whatever your definition of affordable housing is, we need more of it, not less of it. And I think one of the issues to tackle that is tackling zoning, but unfortunately, regardless of what jurisdiction it is, it's always pushback when it comes to affordable housing due to a lot of the stigma. You know, it's you kind of get the not in my backyard mentality, you know, they just ghetto, you know, section it just the regular stereotypes come, they're gonna lower my property values. I mean, I reside in Howard County, and I know when just a year or so ago before the pandemic, they did a huge redistricting out here based off of the affordable housing thing, right? Because I don't want to get on my high horse and talk about Howard County and Columbia, but it's just was like really weird to me that, you know, a conversation that should have been about education kind of boiled down to the issue of zoning and how we got to this point of how certain schools in Columbia were kind of segregated by income, and they decided to move people around to kind of break that up. I'm kind of still on the fence about that, because even in some of my testimony and the things that I spoke about, I was like, it's good that, I guess it's good that we are moving kids to, I guess, a quote unquote better school with better numbers. However, for me, I just kind of look at it like we were just doing it on paper, right? The kids are still going back home to the same segregated neighborhood. So it's really not really doing anything. I feel like the broader issue should have been, again, going back to the zoning, like how is it, you know, in the city of Columbia, we have all these villages, but the most of the affordable housing is only in 3, right? So it didn't make sense to me. And I know Baltimore City has some of the same issues as well. So if, to me, we just need to get over that hurdle. Is it ever going to happen? That's why you say it's my wish list. I'm wishing that we can get over that, and that people can come together and try to come to some conclusion, you know, over time. So that things are not concentrated in areas where it's already concentrated, right? So,
Right. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists, including Peggy, Mark, Tanika, for an excellent discussion and for sharing all of your expertise and perspectives with all of us about what exists, what's needed, and maybe even a little bit about what are the roles that we should be playing in helping to create more housing, ensuring greater justice, and more equity in Maryland. So thanks so much for this wonderful panel. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa and Tanika and Mark and Peggy before she had to leave. This has been a great conversation, and I feel like I've learned a lot, and I hope that the rest of you have as well, about what we can do to promote affordable housing for all here in Maryland. We are going to make these materials and everything, all the resources that were shared in the chat. You should receive a follow-up email about these. We'll also hope that you can join us for our next panel on Saturday, where we will be talking about the intersection of tax policy and racial equity. And so you can register for that. If you haven't yet, go ahead and register for that in the same place that you registered for this one. That will be this Saturday at 10 a.m. also via Zoom. With that, thank you. And we look forward to making some of these ideas a reality in the next legislative session and going forward. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being with us. It's a pleasure.
Sure, I'll be looking forward to joining you on Saturday.
Sounds good.